Presentations and presenting. Patrick's given you an introduction to this section and why it's important. So let's just explore that a little bit further. Why is presenting so important to you as you progress through your strategic consulting project or delivering your innovative idea to an audience? You can have the greatest recommendations. However, it's your ability then to present those in a way that's impactful, memorable, and influences your audience to your way of thinking to ensure your recommendations are taken through to execution. So what we did with you in Unit 4, we went through the Minto model, which we talked through how to develop your argument and your story. Now what we want to talk to you about is how you present that story and that argument that is impactful and influences your audience. So if we move to the next slide, which we've headed up killer presentations. The key elements of a killer presentation are those that get the audience's attention, are those that pass the information over to the audience, use words the audience can understand, and have a well-defined message that are relevant to the audience and eliminate distractions for the audience. So those key elements of a killer presentation, the way I've presented it, is a very word-rich slide. And is that really the best way to actually describe to you what the elements of a killer presentation would be? There is abundance of research on this area of what we call cognitive overload. The human mind has two sets of representations, verbal representation and visual or mental imaging. And both are separate, but they are closely linked. And the challenge you have as a presenter and what you put on your presentation slides is you can create that cognitive overload where the verbal representations and the visual imaging are not aligned. So the risk of presenting a slide like this one is that you could be talking to the top line and the audience could be reading the bottom line. And this effectively causes that cognitive overload, and therefore the ability of the audience to remember what you're saying to make it impactful and memorable is significantly reduced. So let's move to the next slide and look at how that might be represented differently as you as a presenter and the style and design of that particular slide. So let's try that again. So on the next slide, I will take you through the same information. So that we have a presenter and we have an audience. The role of the presenter is to remove barriers and distractions to ensure that the message and the information and the knowledge from the presenter passes to the audience with impact and influence. By taking this approach, we believe that the cognitive overload is removed and you're aligning for the human mind the verbal representation and the visual representation or imagery. Okay, so let's now move to some other key elements of creating that killer presentation. And we have an acronym for you called CRAVE. And that's made up of the concept of chunking, relevance, association, visualization, and elaboration. Let me walk you through each of those elements and give you an example and why it's so important to use this type of thinking to reduce the cognitive overload and to make your presentations influential and impactful and memorable. So the first one's chunking. So as humans, we're really good at remembering 3 to 5 things. So it's important in your presentation, if you look at the next slide, it's how do you chunk down your material so that it's got 3 to 4 messages or 3 to 5 messages. We would prefer 3 and probably 3 words per message, but no more than 5 messages on a slide, because the audience are going to struggle to remember that, and therefore it'll be less impactful if they can't. So I've given you an example on the slide here is where we've broken down a number. It's got a phone number. It's got 11 digits to it. And as you all know, if we broke that down into 3 or 4 elements, it'd be a lot easier to remember. And we find in all the research that chunking is one of the elements that drives the ability of the audience to remember your presentation by 2 to 3 times. So if most presentations you can expect recall at about 10 to 20% of what information you're passing over, we can increase that 2 or 3 times. So we're talking now 30, 40, 50% recall, which is a significant difference by using the concept of chunking. Let's move to the next concept on the next slide, which is all about relevance. And this is where it's really important to stay relevant to the points that the client is focused on. So what are their personal interests and motivations? What did you come up with in your Minto model, the situation complication? It's very important that you stay on track to those elements that are relevant to the client and speak in language that they understand. So once again, we've given you an example here. If you're servicing a motor vehicle engine, the relevance is talking about spanners, nuts and bolts. It's not talking about a hammer and nails and a wooden fence. It's not relevant. The second element of the hammer and the nail is not relevant. So in that simple example, that's what the concept of relevance is. Right, so let's now move to the next element of CRAVE, which is association. And this is where we're focusing on elements of what the client understands in their world. So for example, if you're talking to a client about car insurance, you might use an image of a car on the page of your presentation. It's an association to something the client understands and knows well. On the slide we have in front of you, we've put 3 dice. And maybe we focus on a child who's trying to learn the phone number that we showed you a couple of slides earlier. And the last 3 numbers of that were 426. So the child has association with a game of playing dice. And we then use to throw the dice, come up with the numbers of 426, they're the last 3, and the child will have a much stronger association with those numbers and therefore better recall when they're trying to remember the parent's phone number. The next element of CRAVE is visualization. And this is where an example on the slide that we've just put up is the killer presentation. So it's all about less is more. So you see the example where we've moved from a word-rich page and the complication that can cause to a visual page which actually takes us on the verbal representation and the visual imagery, and we keep that aligned, which reduces significantly that cognitive overload. And once again, it's one of the key contributors to increasing the recall and making the presentation memorable from 10 or 20% up to 50, 60%, which is what you really need to achieve. And then the final element is elaboration. Tell the audience what you're going to tell them. Tell them the story, for example, from your Minto work, and tell them what you've told them. So it's really about elaborating again. And on this page, we've given you the example of it's CRAVE for life, it's CRAVE for selling. So reinforce this acronym is the point of the slide that you have in front of you. So in summary, what's really important here for you is to understand that concept of cognitive overload and to take the client through your story, your recommendations, your innovative idea, both verbally and visually, to align that cognitive load, to make your presentations memorable, with influence and with impact.